Hi, I'm Megan, an educational facilitator. This is the third in a series of videos where we'll be looking at the ideas from educational project, Education for Humanity. Today, I'll be speaking to its founder and co-author of the book of the same name, this time about teaching the human story. Welcome, Simonon.
Hello.
It's also my great pleasure to introduce our guest on this video, Pliny, who is a historian, historical reenactor, and LGBTQ campaigner.
Hello.
Thank you. Simonon, can I begin by asking you, what do you mean by the human story?
Well, if we start where we are in schools, currently students are taught history, his story, written mainly about men, for men, by men. Not her story, and let alone the human story that encompasses all of humanity. So what I have in mind is really three things. One is that all the voices of humanity should be heard across the globe within society. Secondly, that we need to look at how different people experience the same event from their point of view. And thirdly, that humans themselves are complex creatures, and to understand them, we need to understand that what motivates them may not be simply good, bad, but different strands, different currents, some of them rational, some of them visceral, sometimes they're contradictory. So we try and understand the whole human being. So that's essentially what I mean by the human story.
Thank you, Simonon. As somebody who identifies as a her, it's certainly refreshing to hear about her story. Often, especially in my educational experience, it's always been women in relation to men rather than standing on their own and having their own history. So I'm really looking forward to this session. Pliny, what are your views on this?
Well, one of the things that I want to mention is that history is often written from a national perspective. You know, you've got English history, French history, Mauritian history. While there's nothing actually wrong in this approach, we often run the risk of seeing our country, our history, as being special, unlike any others, you know, and recognizing this fact help us to be open to new voices, open to new perspective, and also open to being a global citizen. I mean, to be somebody that is happy to accept that the world history is our common heritage, because civilizations, you know, do not exist in discrete boxes. They tend to influence each other.
Thank you, Pliny. You raised some really interesting points there. Simonon, can you give an example of what you mean by all the voices must be heard?
If we look at this picture here of the world about 1,000 years ago, the first thing I would want to point out is that we live in a world where the West is dominant, militarily, economically, politically, even to some degree culturally. And it's very easy for people to imagine that's just the way it is. But in fact, it's only about 500 years old. And if we go back about 1,000 years, as this map shows, there were many other civilizations contributing to the development of humanity. So let's just start with the Americas, first of all. You'll see there the early Mississippian culture. Now, this was an extensive urban development. There's a capital city called Cahokia, which at its height was bigger than London. So we have these cities, we have these towns, we have this economic activity, we have a whole civilization in the Americas that on the whole people know nothing about. And then moving eastwards across the Atlantic, we come to Africa, and there's a variety of states. Just to take Songhai as an example, here was a sophisticated state based on trade and also metalworking. Metalworking, incidentally, was developed in Africa, the Middle East, not in Europe. And in this case, copper and gold and so forth. Huge hive of economic activity. A lot of the gold that turned up in Europe came from West Africa. And then moving further east again across the Indian Ocean, we end up with the Sung Empire, which is modern China. And during this period, we have all sorts of technological, economic developments. We have, for example, the development of paper money. We have the development of gunpowder. So all this is going on in the 11th century. And yet to the average school child in the UK, and particularly in England, all they would know about is 1066 and Norman invasion, which, as Pliny says, yes, absolutely fair enough, you must know your national history, but isn't it important to understand what's happening in the whole world in any given period, and all the different things that could be contributed to the development of human civilization? So that's what I mean very much by seeing hearing all the voices. And incidentally, that's true about society too.
Thank you, Simonon. Pliny, what are your insights on this issue?
As I mentioned earlier about civilization not existing in discrete boxes, I need to add that knowledge is often preserved and also transferred between civilizations. And if we look at the map again, we can say that the zero, for example, was invented in India, and the use of a zero then moved westwards, through the Fatimids, the Zirids, which are Arab civilization, through the Caliphate of Cordoba, and then it's finally reached the European centers of knowledge, such as Paris. And this is a clear example of how knowledge is being preserved and also being transferred, over time through different civilizations.
Thank you, Pliny. And Simonon, can you give me an example of what you mean by the whole story?
Well, indeed, part of the issue sometimes is that we just look at one aspect of a story as it affected, say, the West or the UK, but not the whole picture. And one of the classic examples of this is Africa, where we look at the slave trade as it affected Europeans and Americans. But we don't really look at the history of Africa at the time. Now, we're looking at the 15th, 16th, 17th century. And one of the first things we notice, and we can see it in this picture, is that West Africa consisted of powerful states with large cities, complex administrations, strong economies, part of which, based on slavery, we're thinking particularly of gold mines and copper mines, yeah. And they were ruled by kings, by elites who made decisions, good and bad, like rulers anywhere in the world, including about slavery. So we had some rulers who refused to trade with Europeans at all, some who saw it as a huge commercial opportunity, some people changed their minds. In some cases, they were pressured by their elites to trade with Europeans. In some cases, there were independent merchants doing deals on the side, all sorts of different responses. What we can say is that they were in positions of power. They were not helpless victims. The historian Basil Davidson put it this way: if Europeans were dominant in the sea, Africans were dominant on land. And they had powerful and very effective armies. So what I'm saying here is that we need to see the story in the round and not just from the point of view as it affects the West.
Pliny, I was wondering what your experience of this is as a historian.
Well, you see, when I speak to people about Africa, the themes that comes frequently into their mind and into the conversation is that of slavery, poverty, and powerlessness. But we need to dig a little bit deeper into history, for instance, into the 13th century. I'm thinking of one of the ruler of Mali. He was the emperor there. He ruled with a senate called Gabara, and they even had a constitution. And that man was fabulously rich. He is Mansa Musa. And it is said that Mansa Musa got all his wealth from the copper mines and gold mines and from salt extraction, for which slave labor was used. He was so rich that when he went on pilgrimage to Mecca, he brought with him 18 tons of gold. 18 tons of gold that today would represent around $1 billion, which he gifted away. And this even made the value of gold decline at the time. So without knowing the whole story, without knowing all these little facts, we tend to confine our view with Africa only with poverty and powerlessness. While if we have a better picture, we can destroy this sort of wrong image that some people do have. Thank you.
Thank you for that insight, Pliny. Simona, in your book, you say it's important we understand how people saw the world. Can you explain this a bit further?
Yes, indeed. I'm going to take one example, and you'll see it in this picture. This is to do with sati. Now, sati was a Hindu custom based on the sanctity of marriage, whereby if the husband died first, and his body was placed on a funeral pyre to be burnt, his wife would voluntarily join him. Now, in fact, it was a very rare phenomenon in India, nevertheless went on. What was happening is that the voluntary bit started to go, and there were scenes reported of poor women being dragged screaming to be burned alive. Now, first of all, within India itself, there was opposition to this, spearheaded by Ram Mohan Roy, tried to not really oppose sati, but improve the lot of women. And then we have the perspective of the British who began to first trade with India and then dominate India. This was done very much as a business. It was the East India Company who engaged with the Indians. And their perspective was, well, India's a place where we make money. That's the end of our interest, really. We're in it for the money. And while local officials objected to sati, they didn't really push it because they didn't want to alienate their customers, basically. That was their point of view. So they kind of left it. And then during the course of the 19th century, we get the rise of evangelical Christians who said essentially that it was not enough just to make money in India, that the British ought to bring the Indians the benefits, as they saw it, of Christian civilization. They viewed the Indians as inferior. They largely ignored Indian culture, and in particular the fact there was a Christian, very long-standing Christian church in India. Their impulse, if you like, was moral. It wasn't just about the money. So it was both racist, patronizing, but in their own terms, caring. So they were coming from somewhere else. Now, the East India Company did their level best to make sure there were no missionaries in India at all, but they lost the battle. And in 1829, a Christian governor, Bentinck, with some hesitation, abolished sati. Now, because it was practiced by a very small number of upper caste Indians, it didn't have an immediate backlash, although later on it was seen as part of a general erosion of Indian culture. And when the Indians fought the First War of Independence, revolt, for some people, the abolition of sati was an issue. So we have one phenomena, sati, but being approached in 4 different ways by people coming from from different positions, as it were. So that's what I mean, is you really need to understand where people are coming from. And it's not just an individual opinion, it's just how they see the world.
Thank you for that, Simonon. What's your take on this, Pliny?
Well, what links Britain and India and Mauritius? It's myself here, and I will be picking an example from Mauritian history. You see, having no native populations, the European colonists had to bring slaves from Africa to work the sugarcane plantation, and after 1833, slavery was abolished, and the freed slaves now did not want to work the lands anymore. So they settled in the coastal areas and did some other jobs. They viewed agriculture as a sign of oppression, as a memory of slavery, and wanted nothing to do with it. So indentured laborers were brought from India. These were men that would work the land. They would be tied down to the land for a period of 10 years, sometimes 5 years. They'll be doing exactly the same work and the slaves were doing, living in the same quarters, and they'll be receiving a derisory pay as well. But for them, these indentured laborers saw agriculture as an opportunity, as a way of escaping poverty, as a way of repaying the debts that they had. So we can see here the same activity, being agriculture, being seen from two different points of view, depending from where people came from. The freed slaves saw it as a sign of oppression, while the indentured laborers saw it as a tool for progress and change.
Thank you, Pliny. That's very interesting. You also talk about people being airbrushed out of history, Simonon. Can you give us examples, please?
Well, yes, and we look at the picture in front of us. Viewers may recognize as hand painting. When these were first discovered, it was assumed they were done by cavemen, cave men. Actually, recent research suggests that 3/4 of them are actually women's hands. And this in a certain sense symbolizes this issue of airbrushing people out of history. Women are the largest group, but there are lots of other groups, marginalized groups, that simply are not mentioned. In the case of women, it covers everything imaginable. I mean, the world of arts, science, so on, leadership. And one of the things we can do in history is look at societies where women played a prominent role, where their contribution was valued and respected. In the book, we look at the Cathars. Now, we're looking at here at southern France, northern Italy, the Balkans. They were a spiritual group in which the priesthood were both men and women. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, they were persecuted by the church, objected, amongst other things, to the fact that women were treated equally. And it was for this very reason that the Inquisition was set up, specifically to deal with the Cathars. Now, as a result of that, a number of them were caught, and the Inquisition took records of what their victims said, and as a result of sort of modern historians interpreting this and rebuilding this, were able to create a picture of medieval women living in a society where they played a prominent role. So there are examples where we can talk about women's history. That's one of them. There are a number, but it's important that we do it. Just to give you an example, I taught an A-level course in which I noticed of 165 pages of the textbook, only 4 mentioned women. If you had been an alien arriving on this planet, you would imagine there was some kind of endangered species. So I think it's a really important thing that we select topics and areas and types of history where women, and indeed other groups, are studied and valued and respected.
Thank you for that, Simon. How does this resonate with you, Pliny?
Well, we do find an example of a woman being airbrushed from history, from Mauritius itself. In 1943, on the sugarcane plantations, the workers had had enough of a miserable condition, of a miserable pay, of how they were oppressed. And they rose in protest. And one of the leaders there was a young pregnant Tamil woman called Anjali Kupen. And she was one of the leaders there, organizing the workers, and she was killed by the police on that day. Anjali, while she's known as being the island's first workers' rights activist, is remembered by having a statue of her on the island, but she's not mentioned in any of the school books at the moment. When I speak to people, whether they are from different ages, from different background, from different cultures as well in Mauritius, very few of them seems to remember her, to remember what contribution she has brought to the island. Also, women tend to be airbrushed when they do not conform to the dominant sexual norms. And I'm thinking here of somebody who was popularized by a BBC serial, who was dubbed the first modern lesbian. Her name was Anne Lister. And we only know about Anne because she wrote a 5 million words diary that ended with her death in 1840. Her diary was then published in the 1990s and 1980s. And it is a miracle, a real miracle, that the diary even reached us, because the first person who deciphered it was urged to destroy the diary because of its subversive content. All right, so we do find here that her diary reached us, and even then people thought that it was a hoax because she described in very explicit details her affairs, her love affairs with a number of women. And one of them was Eliza Rain, who was the half-daughter of an East India Company surgeon. And it is only in 2011 that her diary was put into the UNESCO Memory of the World program. But for one moment, we need to think of how many other diaries have not reached us, of how many other diaries have simply been destroyed because they depicted a lifestyle that was not considered to be the norm.
Thank you for that, Pliny. And thank you both for your insights into the ideas of teaching the human story. This is the last video in this series, but you can find out more by visiting educationforhumanity.co.uk.